In the United States, an eerie relic festers in the backwoods of Arkansas.
There's colorful cartoons that are slowly fading. It's almost like you can hear the children laughing from like 20 years ago.
In the Middle East, an ancient bastion shrouded in myth.
It's only very recently that we've been able to unveil some of the mystery behind this place. The closer you look into those inscriptions, the more detailed knowledge we gain.
A sinister collection of buildings in the Albanian mountains.
But something's not quite right here. This doesn't look like a cared-for space. There are iron bars on the window. The paint is all drab.
And in the heart of England, a subterranean labyrinth hiding a dark purpose.
Part of it's been painted white, part of it's been left bare brown rock. There has to be some significance to this. There's even an area that it was designed for people to sleep, like a dormitory. It's like they were preparing for the end of the world.
Decaying relics. Ruins of lost worlds. Sites haunted by the past. Their secrets waiting to be revealed. In Arkansas, densely forested hills hide an unexpected rural haven.
The Ozarks are America's forgotten mountain range. It's a beautiful, idyllic area that most people are barely aware exists. In the middle of that, we come across this strange little outpost.
This place is gorgeous. You've got creeks and streams and forests and woodlands.
So it's hard to get a handle on what this place really was.
At first, it appears to be some kind of ghost town. But amid the tranquil beauty, more dilapidated structures hint at this site's true nature.
You've got broken scaffolds, metal frames, offices with paper strewn all about the place, buildings overgrown with weeds.
You can just tell how busy this place would have been. This place is vast. There is space for a lot of people here. And there's even a little train line.
The railroad track weaves a course around this 400-acre complex.
There's definitely a certain amount of make-believe to this whole site.
Why is this place abandoned? Because outside of it, it looks like paradise.
A parched slide and forlorn watermill are some of the reminders of the site's lively past. But it seems any success was short-lived. This is Dogpatch USA, once one of the nation's most unusual theme parks.
You know that back in its day, it would have been a noisy place to be. Kids full of excitement queuing up, desperate to get inside. But now that's all gone.
Eddie Sisson helps to look after what's left of this once bustling amusement park. Ever since he first came to Dogpatch, he's been fascinated by its history.
This part of the site is where you would buy tickets and purchase memorabilia. It would be your first place you would go to.
For the people who came here at its peak, the next stage in their journey was a magical descent into an imaginary world.
So after you buy your ticket, you would hop on this tram and you could see everything that awaited you.
But what was so entertaining about this faraway fun fair?
This site has a theme, and that's the key to understanding what this place was about and why it was here.
Dogpatch is an amusement park like no other in America, before or since.
It's a theme park, so in one sense, it's like Disneyland. But there were a few major differences. Instead of mice, fantasy castles, and big rides, you had hillbillies, a few arcades, and a lake full of trout.
Its doors first opened to the public on the 18th of May, 1968.
In the heyday of the park, there would be just tons of people, kids going back and forth, and people eating, people buying tickets, people browsing at the Dogpatch memorabilia. There were just, you know, maybe 800 people in this building at one time.
But why were people so keen to visit these log cabins in the woods? The story of how it came to be dates back 3 decades before the first visitors came.
It's sort of a landmark to a massive cultural shift in America. This park was culturally related to one specific time period. It reflected an America in which people were moving from the agricultural and countrysides into the cities.
The park took inspiration from an unexpected source, a cartoon strip known as Lil Abner, which made fun of that change.
Today, it's hard to remember or to even imagine how influential newspaper comic strips were in the mid-20th century. Little Abner was one of the most popular comic strips, and its creator, Al Capp, was a huge celebrity. He used to go on The Tonight Show. He was friends with presidents.
Lil Abner was set in the fictional Appalachian village of Dogpatch. It was an over-the-top portrayal of rural folk living in the region.
Of course, Al Capp's vision of life in the Appalachians was a very demeaning hillbilly stereotype, but it was also one that people kind of loved and embraced. So when they heard that there was a theme park based on Dogpatch, that was very appealing to a lot of people.
At its height, the cultural phenomenon attracted a readership of over 60 million people.
It wasn't so much about the rides. It was more about the setting and the atmosphere it provided. This is a slightly different take on your average theme park.
For many visitors, this was a chance to be part of a world they had grown up consuming. From catching a fish in the trout pond and having it cooked in the park's restaurant, to watching artisans producing traditional crafts in the cabins, guests were transported into Al Capp's imagination.
It looked just like the Dogpatch in the comic. There was a waterfall, some scruffy hills. There were even a few caves where you could imagine maybe someone was off brewing up some moonshine.
There was a waterfall, a trout farm, there was campgrounds.
One of the largest structures that remains here is the old tower, standing tall, with the long slide flowing down. We've all been to fairgrounds as a kid. You know, this is exactly what you want, fun and games.
In its first year, 300,000 people came to enjoy the Hillbilly theme park.
When it opened to great success. It made a lot of money. It was a very popular theme park.
Lil Abner, the brand, was going really well. There were plans to open a chain of themed restaurants, and there was a TV show in the pipeline too.
What may seem a strange premise for an amusement park today somehow worked. But Dogpatch was about to go on an economic roller coaster all of its own.
By the 70s, things were changing. There was the energy crisis. The price of gas went sky high. The economy was really struggling. Unemployment was high. Inflation was high. People weren't as inclined to take long road trips.
As profits plummeted, the park was put up for sale. The new proprietors believed they could turn its fortunes around, but the odds were stacked against them.
In the 80s, the park was sold and purchased by a company that specializes in building and branding theme parks.
The new owners really thought big. They put in bigger rides, they put in a music venue.
At first, it seemed that Dogpatch's prospects had been revived.
So it's pretty insane that Three Dog Night, Tina Turner, Dolly Parton all performed on this stage. The Dukes of Hazzard people, they got them to come and sign autographs, and you know, that wasn't a normal thing in Arkansas to have people come, you know, huge Hollywood stars.
The park's owners even attempted to install a ski resort to make this a year-round destination. But as the 1980s wore on, no matter how hard they tried to attract new visitors, there was one overriding problem.
Al Cap retired from making the comic character Little Abner in 1977.
So within a few years, you don't have children growing up on Little Abner anymore. They're not clamoring to their parents to go to Dogpatch because they've never heard of Dogpatch. A brand like Disney spends millions of dollars a year reminding everybody about those iconic characters.
You know, originally Dogpatch was over 800 acres, which was larger than Disney World when it started. Disneyland has become huge, trumping everything.
Unable to adapt and keep pace with the changing times, the park fell into bankruptcy. And in 1993, its gates finally slammed shut.
It's sort of sad to walk this ground today because the basic idea wasn't a bad one. A lot of people love the idea of being in the heartland of America, being in a rustic setting, celebrating some of the traditions of rural life or country life.
Dogpatch may be gone forever, but the area's natural beauty could one day bring back the crowds. Recently, the derelict site has been bought by new owners with the hope of making use of its fish-filled lakes.
This feature is the key to all of it. If you can attract people here to fish, then that's the starting point. The idea can grow from there. Maybe there is life left in this place yet.
Near the city of Birmingham, a quiet wilderness is hidden away from prying eyes.
This place is rural, it's remote. It seems as if there's not a lot happening here. That's exactly what you're supposed to think.
There's this mysterious door in the middle of the woods. You start to wonder if there's another world behind that door.
And, in a way, there is.
This complex has endless tunnels. Some of them interconnect, some of them dead end. They also vary considerably in size.
It's like a massive underground labyrinth. Dropping a trail of breadcrumbs is not going to help you find your way out of this place.
But distinctive features soon emerge from the darkness.
There seems to be two halves to this tunnel network. Part of it's been painted white, part of it's been left bare brown rock. There has to be some significance to this.
In the lighter tunnels, it gets a little more civilized. There are office cubicles that have machinery stashed away in them.
There's a kitchen area. There's even an area that it was designed for people to sleep, like a dormitory. It's like they were preparing for the end of the world.
With enough space to house hundreds, if not thousands of people, what was this place built for? And why plan to live down here in the dark? For any lone visitor, these cold, empty halls made for an unwelcoming scene. Even the owner, Sid Robinson, still finds the experience disconcerting.
I find the place is very eerie. It's such a vast space of darkness, especially if you're there with the torch. And it has this presence. I can't put my finger on it, but yeah, it's not comfortable.
But the sense of unease is nothing new.
Working down here, especially during the excavation stages, I know from having interviewed people, spoke to men who worked here, they said it was horrific and it was the most scariest time. You know, it would take a week or two to get used to, the pitch black and the noises.
Originally built and paid for by the British government, it was then turned over to a private company, Rover, for use as factory space.
In the early 20th century, Rover employed thousands of people, and they built some pretty famous vehicles, like the Rover 10, the Meteor, and the Light 6.
Rover made most of the cars they manufactured in-house. They made the chassis, the engine, even the wheels. And in doing so, they established themselves as a trusted British automobile manufacturer.
But why would they put a factory underground? Rover may have been a car manufacturer, but they weren't making automobiles down here. This was a shadow factory.
Known as Drakelow Tunnels, this was once a secret facility designed to keep Britain in the fight against the Nazis.
Now, Germany didn't really have the capacity, at least at the beginning of World War II, to mount a seaborne invasion of Britain. But a necessary precursor was control of the skies.
After the First World War, the government had seized the initiative and began preparing for this looming threat.
Outsourcing was a big part of their answer. The Air Ministry decided to start co-opting car manufacturers in what they called a shadow factory scheme.
The government approached car companies, companies like Rover, and they made a deal. They would build them new factories, and they could build cars in them. But if war ever came, those factories would get converted to aircraft making.
In theory, it was a good plan. But sites like this were only built after a major flaw in it was realized.
The first shadow factories were built right in the shadow of existing car factories. And this made them vulnerable to bombing attacks. Germany just bombed the hell out of them.
The fate of the country was hanging in the balance. To find a solution, they had to start digging.
So, in 1942, about halfway through the war, Rover and its employees were moved to a new locale, Drakelow.
There was no caves here as such to start with. This is all totally man-made. We had at the time 2,000 people working down here doing the excavation for them and creating this fabulous underground factory. We don't actually go down any steps. It's built straight into the side of the hill. So it's all on one level, made it a lot easier for the trucks carrying the materials in and out.
Designed in a repetitive grid system, 4 quarter-of-a-mile-long tunnels form the core of the underground network, with rows of perpendicular routes cutting through them. In total, it offered up the equivalent of around 4 football pitches worth of bomb-proof factory space.
Rover were producing parts for the Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, which was the engines they used in all of the aircraft during the war period. So it was a very, very critical and crucial part of the operations of the war effort at the time.
With men being sent out to fight on the front, new opportunities opened up at the factory.
But where was all the manpower going to come from to build these engines? Where else but the kitchen? Women literally went from cutting cloth to make dresses to cutting steel to make bombers.
Across Britain, numerous shadow factories, many of which were built underground, made the difference.
The Battle of Great Britain was won because they had the airplanes to fight off the Germans.
Without the products of Drakelow, the outcome of World War II for Britain might have been very, very different.
But there are corners of Drakelow's underground maze that seem to tell a different story.
There are these dormitories and what looks like broadcasting equipment, which makes no sense for a factory producing aircraft engines. Clearly, something else happened here as well.
The use of atomic bombs on Japan did more than just end the Second World War. It set in motion a new threat to Britain's security. Just 4 years later, in 1949, the Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb. The Cold War was underway.
By the 1950s, Britain is not only testing out its own H-bomb, it's making extensive plans for how to carry on with government in the event of an attack.
As the nuclear age developed through the 1960s and 70s, Drakelow was called back into action. The bomb-proof tunnels were critical once again.
Britain created a new initiative, initially called regional seats of government. And the idea was you would divide the country into 12 districts.
The RSGs were designed as a way for the British government to continue to operate in the event of a nuclear attack.
Parliamentary members would take shelter at the headquarters of these different regions and would be able to govern there, assuming anyone actually survived the attack. Drakelow was going to house the headquarters for District 9.
We have the BBC broadcasting suite so that a regional government headquarters like this could communicate with all the other regional government headquarters around the country.
But computers and communication equipment were just the final step. More importantly, the site itself would need a major overhaul.
When they updated the site, they sealed off part of the tunnel system, and then they installed new ventilation, air conditioning, heating system. They updated the wiring, alarms, put blast-proof doors on at 4 of the entrances across the way there.
Focusing on a smaller section of the tunnels, the plan was to make this area safe from a nuclear fallout. The sandstone rock might have protected those inside from a nearby detonation, but questions remain over the likelihood of survival beyond that.
You know, you'd think, all right, it'll be sealed in every little nook and cranny. Well, although they bricked off the old factory area, at the end of the main corridor was the original factory doors, which were wooden. And then they had 2 little wooden doors separating this bunker from the factory. So should the fallout be sort of making its way around through the countryside, it would quite easy to come through, you know, round the edge of the door frame or around through the ventilation system some way. Even though they got these special filters to recirculate the air, by no means was this place airtight.
While Drakelow was a vital part of Britain's defense in the Second World War, the rush to put something in place quickly ahead of the next threat may not have paid off.
With Drakelow, you're trying to do it on the cheap. It's just obviously not going to work. But, you know, at least the tunnel's got a new paint job.
Fortunately, the site never faced the ultimate test and was finally shut down and sold off in 1994. Today, parts of Drakelow Tunnels have been opened up to the public, offering a glimpse into Britain's underground efforts to protect the country throughout the 20th century. Among the craggy peaks of the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights, an ancient structure keeps watch over the landscape.
It's formidable. It sits high above one of the most fiercely contested areas on the face of the earth.
It's an exceptionally dramatic setting. And wherever you look, there seem to be more tunnels, more corridors, and walls that are extraordinarily thick.
The imposing ruins spread along the ridgeline for almost a third of a mile.
Walls have crumbled, but it's just marvelously intact.
Below ground, the curious maze continues.
There's a tunnel that leads in and out through a hidden entrance, and then there's this subterranean area that looks like it's been flooded.
Guarding this geopolitical flashpoint, the deserted structure is clearly defensive. But who built this fortress and why?
Stories are told about this place, of links to the Bible, of the Tower of Babel. This is, even today, a place of myth and mystery.
It's only very recently that we've been able to unveil some of the mystery and get to the real story behind this place.
This commanding stronghold dates back to the end of the 11th century. Lior Shelef has been exploring this mythical clifftop bastion for many years.
When I first came here as a boy, I was fascinated by the fortress, the size of it and all the mystery around it. Who built it? Why do you want to build it here, especially here?
This is Nimrod Fortress.
It's named after the biblical character Nimrod, who was believed to have been the king who ordered the construction of the Tower of Babel, that extraordinary structure that stretched from earth right up into the heavens.
There was a legend circulating that Nimrod had been bothered by a mosquito in his ear, so in an act of regal arrogance, he'd cut off his own head and replaced it with one of gold, and that as sort of divine punishment for this act of arrogance, he'd been buried in the valley beneath this fortress.
Those who built Nimrod did not take the defense of this place lightly.
It's huge. You can see it from everywhere. The rocks are big, their curves big, everything here is big. It's big because this is the business cards of the people that build it. They want people from all around it to see it, and then they wouldn't dare to come near it. What's amazing to see and interesting is the amount of effort that was done in creating such an accurate spot for the archer to stand, overlooking the exact angle he needs to watch. If you stand here with your bow and arch, and you're aiming to the exact point you need to see in the valley, it's just breathtaking. Wow.
This castle was built for military effectiveness. Many of the details of the military architecture are incredibly well preserved. There are the multiple layers within the castle of fortifications within fortifications to withstand repeated waves of attacks.
The fort's layout betrays its specific purpose.
The fortress is built as an army base. You won't find here beds, you won't find rooms here, you won't find quarters, there's nothing. This is an army base and it's built only for this purpose.
But who or what was this army protecting?
The strategic significance of this Nimrod castle is that it lies on this high ground, blocking access from the Mediterranean coast inland to Damascus.
Any invading force would land at Tyre and make their way through the Golan Heights before taking Damascus.
They chose to build the fortress specifically here because it makes sure it prevents from anyone to attack the people that will go from Damascus, which is about that way, and the port of Tyre.
Damascus was a key seat of power at the time, and the main road to Damascus was a fundamentally important military highway.
Late in the 11th century, crusading Christian armies came from the west, intent on recovering the so-called Holy Land from Islamic rule.
The Crusades were a defining part of the medieval world and of the medieval mind. Western Christian knights rode east, partly to contain Islamic forces which were expanding in the region, but also to retake and conquer, as Christian, all those holy sites from the Bible.
This whole area was a battlefield, and you see Crusader castles speckling this region where the Crusaders would create these strongholds to defend and to advance their cause.
So, at the turn of the 20th century, when Western archaeologists first arrived, they were quick to assume that the beautiful fortress had been built by their own Crusaders.
They assume and they want to believe that this is a Crusaders' fortress. Actually, until 1987, history books that were written about this fortress describe it as Crusaders' fortress.
Nearby castles around the Golan Heights seem to confirm their assumption.
If we look to the east, we can see, first of all, Bufo, Crusaders' fortress that sits in Lebanon, not that far from us, and Hunin, another Crusaders' fortress. And this helps us to understand why people thought for so many years that this fortress is actually a Crusaders' fortress.
But details scattered around the fortress suggest an altogether different story.
The first clue that we have here in the northwest tower is this inscription in Arabic that gave us an idea why this fortress wasn't built by Crusaders.
This was built by the Islamic forces.
In 1187, Saladin, a brilliant military strategist from modern-day Iraq, swept across the region and conquered many Crusader strongholds.
Saladin and his heirs begin building fortifications to hold back this Christian tide. And Nimrod is a Islamic-designed castle.
This castle was built by one of Saladin's nephews in anticipation of yet another battle.
They knew what it took to succeed in this hostile terrain, as hidden features at this site confirm. An elaborate water cistern kept the fortress well stocked, even under siege. And that wasn't the only contingency if the castle was surrounded.
Well, this is the secret passage. An interesting way to run away from the fortress if you need and to smuggle some things if you're under attack. And they built the secret passage in a very interesting way. It was hidden by a huge bush. Basically, no one can see it if you didn't want to.
Nimrod Fortress was built to stand up to the waves of warring crusaders coming from the west. But Saladin and his dynasty were looking in the wrong direction.
In the mid-13th century, their defenses essentially reversed to deal with an influx of Mongol invaders from the east.
But after years of conflict with the Crusaders, Nimrod was eventually taken without a single stone being thrown. The Mongols were so feared that the occupants surrendered and were happy to simply be spared their lives.
The Mongols were soon driven out of the fortress and it returned to Islamic rule. When Ottoman forces finally took over in 1517, Nimrod was no longer in a strategic location.
During the Ottoman period, one of the towers, a 4-story structure that was quite luxurious enough for anybody to have lived in normally, was converted and used as a prison.
But the shattered remains that litter this rocky outcrop were not the work of any marauding army.
A huge earthquake that happened here broke a little bit of the fortress, but not too much. As we can see the rocks around us, there's only a little bit of ruins.
As if prophetic, Nimrod's fortress was shaken by an earthquake, just as Nimrod's tower was toppled by the forces of God.
Following the earthquake, Nimrod Fortress was finally abandoned to the elements. Nimrod Fortress has stood for nearly 1,000 years, overlooking a region that continues to be contested. And the legacy of its ancient origins can still be felt to this day.
For centuries, the Crusades were seen as a dusty old subject, but now you can open a newspaper and read that very same language. Crusade, holy war, jihad, martyrdom. Those ideas that were current at the time this castle was built are still as relevant today in our modern world.
On a mountain in northern Albania, a complex of buildings balances precariously close to the peak.
This place is definitely out of the way. It's miles and miles from the nearest town.
The buildings here are established, but the road is anything but.
It's basically a dirt road cut through the mountains.
There's little to suggest what this location was used for. But at its center, an austere building appears to offer up some clues.
It's a very unusual place to find a building quite like this. It looks like your stereotypical baddie's headquarters.
There's a definite structure to this place.
This setup isn't incidental. It had a purpose. There was investment here, and many people several thousand feet above sea level.
So what was this sinister collection of buildings teetering on an Albanian mountainside? Zenel Drangu was 24 when he first arrived here.
I came here and I saw people gathered in the terrace. And I sincerely thought, this looks like a zoo.
That was back in 1972, when this place had been in operation for 4 years. But what was it built for?
But when you look a little closer, it's clear that it was actually a mining operation.
If you've got a massive mining operation here, it makes sense that your workforce live here.
We often think of mines as pits sunk deep into the ground. But here, thousands of feet up in the air, there were resources so rich that it was worth climbing up the mountain to get to them.
They were digging for iron, copper, zinc, and if they were lucky, a bit of gold too.
Zenel worked here as a miner. He remembers the mine's vast scale.
About 900 of us worked here. So, 3 shifts, all divided in groups that would take the ore out.
This was a huge operation. It would have needed a lot of manpower to run this place.
But there are signs that this was no ordinary mine.
Something isn't quite right here. It's almost like they didn't care for the welfare of the people who lived here. There's lots of barbed wire and iron bars.
Workers like Zenel were not here by choice.
This is Spac prison, one of the most notorious labor camps in Albania.
Here at the camp, inside its core, where we are now, we had 5 rows of fences, and every 10 meters, there were the sentry boxes and guard posts of the soldiers.
This horrifying gulag dates back to 1968 and the notorious reign of communist leader Enver Hoxha.
Albania had been a communist country since the 1940s. But after the death of Stalin, Albania's leader decided that the Soviet Union was straying too far from the core values of communism, so severed all ties with the Soviet Union and with China, and decided to go it alone.
The aim seemed to be for Albania to become a shining example of communism, whether its citizens liked it or not.
All criticism of the state was forbidden. And perhaps the very worst example of criticism was trying to leave, which was strictly illegal.
In 1972, Zenel fell foul of the brutal regime. He fled from Albania to neighboring Yugoslavia, but was soon extradited back to his homeland.
I was sentenced to 20 years at the age of 24, a sentence that I served here.
The regime relied on it not being questioned or criticized, and if you did, you ended up being put away in places like Spac for re-education, where you were shut away from public view.
Zenel suffered alongside the rest of those incarcerated here.
The situation was difficult. Conditions were inhumane. It's that hard in the mines gallery because you have all sorts of gases, smoke, and smells, almost like that of rotten bodies. It smelled acidic.
The facility was effectively a slave labor camp. The inmates were forced to work inhumanly long hours with unrealistically high productivity quotas for the mining.
And the prisoners' Spartan living quarters offered no respite, with up to 54 men sleeping in each room.
The rooms are very small, almost like cages. I mean, there's basic living, but this is something else.
Another terrifying aspect of life there was that the authorities offered time-off sentences for those who agreed to spy on their fellow prisoners, so you didn't only have to watch out for the guards and the warders.
I said nothing to my co-workers because you never know what kind of people you'd run into. Somebody could be a good person, but somebody else could easily be someone who would report you to the command.
But these draconian measures could not break the prisoners' spirit. On the 21st of May, 1973, the inmates of Spac prison staged a revolt.
The prisoners had just had enough. They'd had enough of being incarcerated in dreadful conditions for trivial offences, and they fought back. They seized the warden's guns, they fortified the prison, and they took control.
The rebellion was bold and brave, but it had a fatal flaw. They were stuck up the mountain with only one road down. Waiting at the bottom was the state police. But they didn't need to storm the prison and risk their own lives. All they needed to do was cut off the prison's water supply.
The police cut off the water supply from the bottom of the valley. And it was only a matter of time before the rebellion was quashed. Zenel had just arrived at the prison and did not play an active role, but he witnessed the surrender.
So after 3 days, they cut the water supply and the food, and they had nowhere to go, and the prisoners surrendered. They handcuffed all the prisoners. In fact, 80 of them were given additional 25-year prison terms. 4 of them were then executed by firing squad, and they showed us their pictures to stoke more terror.
Zenel had to make a decision about how to survive in this place.
I thought about my family, that I would not want to bring any harm to them, because if I had tried to escape the way many others had escaped, they would exile my family. In fact, they would take revenge on my family.
Spac continued to operate as a labor camp until the fall of the Albanian Communist Party in the early 1990s. Almost 20 years later, a private company started to mine here once more. Having suffered the brutal conditions of Spac prison for 14 years, Zenel now hopes that it will one day become a national monument.
Let's hope we will one day fix it, so that visitors who might come, especially young ones, would know what this nation went through.